President Trump does not quite believe in great power competition. And so he does not see India's importance in the U.S. calculus in a way that his predecessors did.
Unabashed.
The most unpredictable
Becomes a headline.
The most volatile.
Outrageous behavior.
Unsubstantiated narratives. A battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. For a quarter century, Washington policymakers made a strategic bet on India premised on the belief that shared values, shared interests, and a shared strategic convergence in Asia would bind these two countries together as natural allies in the 21st century. All of this optimistic talk came crashing down to earth a few months ago with the Trump administration's decision to slap 25% tariffs on Indian exports. This was exacerbated by a second decision to add an additional 25% tariff on India for its import of Russian oil. Taken together, these policy measures plunged U.S. India relations into their most significant crisis since the late 1990s, when the U.S. sanctioned India in the aftermath of the 1998 nuclear tests. How did we get here? Where are we now? And where might we be going? These are the questions I'd like to ask my guest and friend on today's show, Ashley J. Tellis. Ashley is the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment. He is well known to Grand Tamasha listeners as one of the clearest, wisest, sanest voices on South Asia and U.S. India relations more specifically. I'm very pleased to welcome him back to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Milan. It's always great to be back.
I want to ask you about what probably feels like ancient history to you, which is an essay you wrote in 2019 with former ambassador to India, Bob Blackwell, your colleague. In this piece, which we will link to, you articulated, I thought very clearly, what you described as a U.S. policy of strategic altruism towards India. And I just want to quote some of that history. You said, "Generous U.S. policies were not merely a favor to New Delhi, they were a conscious exercise of strategic altruism. When contemplating various forms of political support for India, U.S. leaders did not ask, 'What can India do for us?' They hoped that India's upward trajectory would shift the Asian balance of power in ways favorable to the United States." Now, some people, I've realized in recent days, have taken issue with this idea of strategic altruism because they say no country behaves altruistically. They're driven by a hard-nosed pursuit of national interest. How do you square those two?
I think it's a mistake to think that the United States did not do this out of self-interest. It did. But focusing on the noun altruism to the neglect of the adjective strategic is what gets us into these conundrums. Of course, we were very careful to make the point, particularly within internal audiences in the government, when we were proposing this definition of how to think about India. We were very careful to make the point that this is ultimately in America's interest. And so it was a question of how do you understand that interest? And we understood that interest in two ways. One, the objective changes that U.S. policy towards India could make to the shape of the larger balance of power, which was in America's interest. And two, a very conscious effort to move away from what academics call specific reciprocity to something that was more akin to diffuse reciprocity. So there was never the view that we were doing this as an act of charity.
Out of the goodness of our own hearts.
Yes. It was not an act of charity. But we did take difficult decisions without asking what the immediate payoffs would be. And the U.S. India civil nuclear deal was a classic example, where we need not have done it. I mean, that's something people forget, that the Bush administration need not have done it. But it did it because it believed, one, it would be a door opener to a much more vibrant relationship than would have been the case otherwise. And two, because we objectively thought that if India had access to more and more U.S. high technology, and nuclear energy technologies were just the beginning, it would give India that additional lift in order to propel its own ascendancy. So I will be the first to admit that there was definitely a self-interested calculation. But we thought that both sides would come out the better for it. And I think that is strategic altruism, right? It doesn't ask India for repayment. It just looks carefully at the fact that India will be transformed in this process, including in its relationship with us, as being the payoff.
Right. So that was then. I want to bring us to now. If you go around town, as we all do, and you ask any South Asia watcher, how did we arrive at this nadir in U.S. India relations? You'll have any number of theories and explanations. You're a University of Chicago man. You believe in breaking things down to first principles. What is the most parsimonious explanation of how we got to where we are today?
So I think the most parsimonious explanation is to look at the interaction of structure and individual decision-making. And there are changes at both ends. When it comes to structure, I think you are looking at an administration that has a very different view of the world. It doesn't think of the world in terms of conventional geopolitics. The big bet we made on India was in the context of a world of great power competition. And in that world, we saw India as being a natural ally. And strategic altruism followed from that calculation. I think the Trump administration, or at least President Trump, I should be careful, President Trump does not quite believe in great power competition. And so he does not see India's importance in the U.S. calculus in a way that his predecessors did, or for that matter, in a way that he did in his first term, right? So that has changed as far as structure goes. And then, of course, when it comes to individual decisions, he is a larger-than-life personality who calls the shots on everything his administration does. And in the last 3 months, he made certain decisions entirely almost as an act of personal whim. And that is really what accounts for where we've ended up. So India's dropping in importance because of the absence of that structural constraint, the constraint to preserve a balance of power in Asia. And then President Trump's own personality, where decisions were made because he felt that he was not given due importance for his contributions in the India-Pakistan ceasefire and so on and so forth. And it's the interaction of these two elements that really has produced this outcome.
So just to produce one more second, there are some people, and I have to say I strongly disagree with them, who believe that there was an inevitability to the downturn, saying if you go back to the Biden administration, there were visible cracks. And so regardless of who the president might be, we would eventually gotten here. You don't subscribe to that
I don't
theory.
believe that for a moment, because I saw at very close quarters that when we had differences between the United States and India in the Biden years, the response of the administration was very, very different from the response of the Trump administration. The Biden administration bent backwards to protect the relationship with India, precisely because they saw India as being that integral component in great power competition with China.
Right.
And the president, I think President Biden, was far more careful with respect to how he dealt with disagreements with India. We always kept those disagreements private. We always handled them behind closed doors. And we ended up, I think, with solutions that were more or less good. But we did it outside the public eye without embarrassment either to the Indians or to ourselves.
Right. And your expectation, I realize this is now in the realm of speculation, is that had we gotten a Harris presidency, or for that matter, a traditional internationalist Republican presidency, we probably would have ended up more or less in the same place.
I think so.
Yeah.
To me, as long as the United States took its bearings from the fact that it was a world where it would be competing with China, it was a world where maintaining the liberal international order was fundamentally in our interests. As long as we had those two bookends, I think we would have ended up in pretty much the same place where George W. Bush left us.
So when it comes to India's current position, you were quoted in a recent Wall Street Journal piece as describing it as, in a word, waiting. And you went on to say that the Modi government has displayed a remarkable equanimity in public, while keeping open lines of communication to the Trump administration. Can the Modi administration afford to simply bide its time and hope this administration comes around?
I think they're certainly trying to do that. And they're doing it not simply because of the personality of the prime minister. They're doing it because it is in their strategic interest to maintain every opportunity to protect the U.S. India relationship. Despite Prime Minister Modi's visit to Tianjin and all those photographs that were taken with, Presidents Putin and Xi, I think Prime Minister Modi understands fully that there is no substitute for the United States when it comes to Indian security, Indian prosperity, and so on and so forth.
Trade, technology, I mean, the list is quite long, actually.
Absolutely. And so what he is doing, in my judgment, is, biting his tongue, stiffening his lip, and simply hoping to ride this out. Now, they've done a couple of things, which I think are extremely important to keep in mind. They have kept open lines of communication with the administration.
Right.
And they have engaged in a dialogue, very respectfully, with the objective of trying to solve the problems that bedevil us.
Yeah.
So whether it's a matter of Russian oil or whether it's a matter of trade, India has been nothing but responsive. And so they are making an effort. And I'm hoping that in the weeks to come, we will actually see the early fruit of that effort.
So let me just pause on a second, right? Because the question that I keep asking myself is, if I'm New Delhi, what else can I do? I've already proposed tariff cuts, probably the most significant cuts I've ever proposed. Maybe not as much as the U.S. administration would have liked to see, but, nothing. I'm already saying, look, I'm happy to buy more U.S. crude and more LNG. I already intend to amend my nuclear liability laws to make it possible for foreign companies to invest in the civilian nuclear space. I'm buying and will buy more U.S. defense kit. What other levers does India have beyond that?
Not many. And so what I expect to see happen is a continuation of the dialogue and hopefully success in their attempts at persuasion. Because when senior officials sort of take the entirety of the U.S. package, everything that you've described,
and other things too. I'm just giving you the abbreviated list.
Sure. Take that to the president and say, this is what India has put on the table. You just hope that, sort of wiser counsels prevail and that the president sees the value in accepting a win, because it is a win.
Right.
It is a win for him. The fact that India has moved so far, as you point out, on issues like it has never done before, to my mind, is a win for President Trump. And he should
pocket it
at some point, be gracious enough to accept it. And it's never the end of the road. There will always be an opportunity to come back and get more, because that's the nature of all interstate relations. But there is enough there on the table for both sides to walk away with very pleased at what they've achieved.
So let's just go back a bit to the issue you raised, which is these images we've all seen of the SCO summit. There's that famous picture, the kind of chummy picture of Xi and Modi and Putin gathering together for this photo op. Now, I find the response to this has been very polarized. You have one set of people who say, this is nothing new. Modi had planned to go to the summit. The relationship with Russia is well known and well documented. There hasn't in any way been a kind of thaw with China underway, even before this president has taken office. But then you have others on the opposite side who say, actually, this looks like the beginning of some kind of strategic realignment, a reset. Where do you come down on the spectrum?
Well, it's certainly not a realignment by any means. India's relationship with Russia has always been good, for most part. It is a relationship that will remain, I think, in good repair, because both sides have big equities in it. India's relationship with China is improving slowly. And the operative word is slowly. But I don't think it will ever end up in a full-fledged rapprochement, which fundamentally undermines their interests in a robust relationship with Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter what we saw in Tianjin, and certainly the choreography was designed to satisfy both Modi's constituency at home as well as to send a message to Washington. But that notwithstanding, I do not see any fundamental realignment underway. The Indians understand the limits of their relationship, even with Russia, no matter how good it is. And they certainly understand the limits of the relationship with China.
The symbolic messaging to Washington, did it get through?
I think so, because you saw that very uncharacteristically, that uncharacteristic tweet that the president put out. Oh no, we've lost India and we've lost
deep,
China.
dark China.
Yes, that's right. It sort of almost felt like a sense of pathos, surrounding the message. I think the imagery certainly hit home, and I think it played a role in people around the president asking the question of whether this is where we want to leave the relationship with India.
Yeah.
And thankfully, it appears that wiser minds prevailed. And we've seen some element of a rebuilding in the last few weeks.
I mean, I have to just pause and give credit where credit is due. And I do think that we should recognize that the Modi government, I think, has handled this admirably. I am struck by the degree of message discipline the Indians have exercised in not taking the bait and having a rather workmanlike attitude. There have been very few stray remarks that would suggest that they've really got their noses bent out of joint. I mean, do you agree with that assessment?
I agree with that completely. I think the Indian government understands full well the stakes in the relationship with the United States. And they were not willing to leave anything to chance. And so even though there was a national chorus of disapproval of both President Trump personally and the United States more generally, the government of India did nothing to bait that sentiment. And again, I see that as part of the very calculated nature of the Indian reaction.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
So I want to quote something you said to Bloomberg in a story they published, and we'll link to it, in which you said, Trump is indeed the great peacemaker. He deserves all the credit for stimulating the incipient rapprochement between Delhi and Beijing. I want to ask about India-China for a moment. After the Galwan attacks, my sense is the Indian government decided, look, we can no longer pursue a strategy of economic cooperation and strategic competition because the two are inextricably linked. And they made moves to decouple, both in terms of trade, investment, tech, and so on and so forth. Today, though, there's a very different tune being sung in Delhi, right? Which is actually, we have this thaw on the border, we need capital, the economy is not necessarily firing on all cylinders, and so we maybe would welcome Chinese investment in limited sectors that are not controversial, not sensitive, and so on and so forth. Is Delhi in danger of repeating the same mistakes of the past? Because in some ways we've seen this movie before. Economic cooperation, strategic competition, and they ultimately decided you couldn't basically, maintain that equilibrium.
No, I don't think Delhi is on the cusp of making a mistake. I think the reaction that drove the partial decoupling after Galwan was really a function of the poverty of levers that India had. India did not have a great many levers to move the Chinese. And so they used the levers that were within reach. But I think there was always a recognition that India simply cannot grow without connectivity to China as an economic partner. Now, you have to be smart about how you use that connectivity, and I see the Indians being very prudent about it. But in some way, the restoration of economic links and certainly the expansion of diplomatic links, which we will see, are all part and parcel of the same effort to put a previous relationship back on track. And I think India can do that if it is careful, very, very successfully. It is not enhancing its vulnerability. It is simply being prudent in those areas where it needs to protect its interests. It's keeping the Chinese away. In those areas where there's really no risk to India, it's going to use Chinese resources to build itself. And I think that's a great thing to do.
Just on the subject of levers, there's a similar question could be applied in the U.S. context, right? I mean, there is a reason that Trump has not gone after China on Russian oil and has gone after India, which is, frankly, I assume the president thinks that India is a soft target. Does India have levers vis-a-vis the United States?
Not many. Not many. I think they recognize when it comes to trade, when it comes to defense equipment, when it comes to broad issues of national security, being in the U.S. corner is much, much better than being outside it. And I think the Prime Minister has suffered the indignities of U.S. policy in the last 3 months, while still attempting to maintain the nation's self-respect, which is really what accounts for the fact that India has not responded to the provocations, wherever they come from, but has maintained that discipline with respect to messaging, and not just in messaging, because even in private communications, they have maintained a willingness to resolve Trump's grievances. So it's not simply just placating him for the sake of placating him. Right. There have been serious substantive discussions that have gone on over the last 3 months, outside of the public eye, which is where they should have been anyway.
Do you think that let me put it the other way, do you think Modi can placate Trump on the narrow question of U.S. efforts to bring India and Pakistan and that conflict to an end? Because that was clearly a trigger. There's a lot of water under this bridge. May 10th, 11th seem like ancient history, but it's quite possible that's something the president would still desire. Is the prime minister in a position to give him something there?
Nothing at all. And we will just have to wait and hope that President Trump comes to the realization that there is really no useful role he can play. Encouraging both sides to talk, that's always a wonderful thing to do. It might even be welcomed in both societies. The government of Pakistan would certainly desire it. But given that India finds that an impediment, or for multiple reasons, I just think President Trump has to come around to recognizing that any overt intervention of the sort that he imagines, he has to recognize that that's going to create more problems than solutions.
But that's going forward. But if we look backward, do you think that Prime Minister Modi can do anything to give a kind of hat tip to President Trump about the Operation Sindoor ceasefire?
Well, I guess he could do it if he was willing to accept some creative rewriting of history. But, the simple thing that could have been done without prejudice to the Indian position would have been to simply thank the president for everything his administration did. Because I think it is simply factually correct to say that the Trump administration did play a role. Now, the specific role that the president played is debatable. Is a different question. But the administration certainly played a role. And from everything I have seen, it has been a helpful role. And I think India can, admit to that role without prejudice to its position that these big issues with Pakistan have to be settled bilaterally.
I mean, the simplest way one could have done it, I'm not saying this would work today, would have been shortly after the ceasefire, saying something along the lines of, we thank our American friends for helping to put an end to Pakistani adventurism.
Absolutely.
Where you put the onus on Pakistan,
Absolutely.
but you give a kind of fill-up to the United States.
And previously, India has done that, right? India has done that in the past. I mean, they've relied on the United States to lean on Pakistan. And at the appropriate times, we've thanked the United States, for the role it's played.
I want to actually come to this question of the U.S. and Pakistan, because in any discussion of the U.S. and India right now, we can't really sidestep this issue. We've seen what I think is kind of a dramatic reset, certainly not one I had anticipated in America's relations with Pakistan. This is likely to introduce a fresh irritant into the U.S.-India bilateral relationship. What do you see as the underlying basis for a reset of ties with Pakistan? I mean, if you were trying to kind of put yourself in the Trump administration's shoes, what do you think the logic is?
I mean, I'm hard-pressed to find a real logic.
Okay.
I think it's the president's own fascination with the praise that the Pakistanis showered in him after the crisis. Which was lavish. He enjoys that.
Right.
And so I think he embraced it. And he embraced it on premises that I think will prove not to be true.
Mm-hmm.
So the expectation that Pakistan can service American energy needs is highly questionable.
Yeah.
That Pakistan can serve as a new source of critical minerals, I think is, again, highly questionable.
Oh, and certainly unproven.
And certainly unproven. And I think, people have looked at these things in the past and, the answers have been too meager, too expensive, not worth doing. I don't think the answers are going to be different this time around. And so, like so many things, the president has acted on an impulse. Whatever the merits of that impulse are, he will come around, I think, at some point to realize that this is not exactly a productive investment, and it will taper off.
I have to admit that there is another line that I find a little bit like an ex post rationalization, which has to do with Pakistan's role in the Middle East and the role they might play vis-a-vis the Gulf with Israel, based on their long connections to various governments, militaries, and leaders, and so on and so forth. Do you see that as being a real justification, or this is just sort of, because we're in the business of coming up with analytical frameworks, we've come up with this one?
Well, it's certainly a creative exercise of the imagination. If anything, Pakistan is far more dependent on Middle Eastern partners than the Middle Eastern partners are on Pakistan. And so the idea that Pakistan is a fulcrum, either for the United States in its outreach to the Middle East, or that Pakistan can independently shape outcomes in the Middle East to the advantage of the United States, I think these are fantasies.
Leaving aside the role of the United States, which I think you've been very clear that the present government of India would not welcome U.S. mediation and what they see as fundamentally a bilateral dispute. And I think that there's a lot of consensus in India, certainly on that point. Is there any inkling that you have seen post-Sindoor that the government of India would want to engage in its own bilateral set of talks with the Pakistani leadership?
I think they would always want to engage with Pakistan if the circumstances permit. But their big challenge right now is that they don't have a worthy interlocutor. They will not engage with the Pakistan army because they see the army as being an inveterate opponent of India and everything India stands for. And I think the Prime Minister, if you were to push him, would tell you that he wished he could engage Shehbaz Sharif and his government. But if they are not masters of their own mansions, I mean, how much stock do you put in that kind of engagement? And so this is the Indian dilemma at this point. I think they would want to engage, but they don't really see a partner on the other side who is capable of engaging in ways that might be productive. Now, this is a problem internal to Pakistan. It's been a problem that's been endemic in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it's not one that can easily be fixed, and certainly not fixed by India.
Last week, we saw Sergio Gore, who is Trump's nominee to be the next ambassador to India, have his confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As many people will know, he's been kind of, if confirmed, will be dual-hatted as ambassador and an envoy for South and Central Asian affairs, which is very vague. And you can kind of imagine whatever you'd like about what that means. Did we learn anything, or did you learn anything from his confirmation hearing, from his statement, and from the general kind of ambiance, atmosphere, questions in the committee room?
Well, nothing with respect to how this role of the special envoy is conceived, nor anything that he might want to do. My understanding is that this is still quite vague, and the details of the obligations of that position have not yet been defined. There are many dimensions to it, including sort of issues of division of labor within the U.S. government itself that have to be addressed. My sense is I can understand people's fear and certainly Delhi's concern that this might be the spear point of a mediation effort. But I suspect that's not where it'll go.
Because ultimately the U.S. will also discover that this is going to be kind of a non-starter.
And I think nominee Gore himself will not want to put himself in a position where his effectiveness as an ambassador is compromised because there are swirling questions about what he's supposed to do as an envoy.
I want to just, again, pause on this for a second. I mean, you served in the embassy in New Delhi with Ambassador Blackwell. You've seen that set up close and personal, maybe more up close and personal than you would have liked. And so you essentially know how this place works and how this functions as a U.S. embassy and what the constraints are. As you think about Sergio Gore, who currently is the head of, presidential personnel in charge of staffing the executive branch, a lot of people said, well, he doesn't have any knowledge of the region, doesn't have any India expertise, but he is very close to the president. I mean, how do you see this nomination in terms of where we are today and what an ambassador must and mustn't do?
Well, he has the single biggest credential that matters for the job. He's close to the president. You don't need ambassadors who know the names of the 7 rivers of India. What you need are ambassadors who have very good relations with the chief executive, who can use that relationship to guide the president's thinking about what his policy towards India should be. And that is what Sergei Gore is entirely capable of doing. Now, there are other things that he should do for success. One, I would say, is keep the best relationships possible with your host government. It was amazing to watch how Ambassador Blackwell operated in Delhi. He kept his relationship with the host government in perfect repair, so that any time he wanted a meeting with any one of the principals, he got it. And because he had the reputation of being very close to President Bush, he was in the Vulcans group that worked with the president during the campaign and so on and so forth, people knew that what he said ultimately reflected the president's preferences. Sometimes even when the State Department was not exactly on the same page. And so that gave him enormous credibility. And then the third thing I would add is it pays to take on board and utilize creatively the professionalism of the people who work for you at the embassy. Because many of the folks have put time in India. They understand the Indian milieu. And if nominee Gore is able to use their skills when he is confirmed as ambassador and gets to Delhi, I think he'll really be well served. Because the one thing I learned during my Delhi years was that the people in the embassy are patriots and they're extremely hardworking. And if you inspire them to give their best, they'll give you more than their best. And so you just have to have the wisdom to know how to get the best out of the people who work for you.
I want to kind of end this conversation by asking you about the future, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that it is possible, maybe even plausible, that the two countries will strike some kind of trade deal in the near future. It's impossible to say if it's in 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, but I could see that being an eventuality, and even see this 50% tariff rate settle at something that's closer to what has been applied to some of India's other Asian counterparts, for instance. But it's undoubtedly true that this recent spat has given a lot of skeptics within the Indian environment ample fodder for basically saying, I told you so. Even if we get through the short-term bump in the road, how concerned are you about the long-term implications for the level of trust between these two partners?
So I think the relationship has certainly taken big hits, but it is not irreparable. And I think the fact that the Indians recognize that they need the United States for their own self-interest, and I hope in time the U.S. will recognize that we need India for our own self-interest. That's the foundation on which this relationship will repair itself. So I'm not pessimistic about the long-term trajectory of this relationship because fate has bound us together. There is an Asian balance of power that we both have a vested interest in, even though we have a bout of strategic amnesia at the moment. But sooner or later, we'll come to our senses. And when we come to our senses, we'll recognize that we are both better off with a strong partnership between our two countries than with a relationship that is floundering on alienation.
But the ultimate fear in the hearts of Delhi policymakers is that this president, or really any U.S. president, frankly, might make a move towards some kind of strategic detente with China that would result in the creation of a G2 world. Does that seem like a realistic fear?
I mean, it's a fear that's always at the back of the minds of Indian leaders. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of what your theory of politics is. If you believe that international politics is ultimately about competition, then I think even if we could somehow concoct a G2, that G2 would not last. And that's really the opportunity that opens up for India. And so if I were in Delhi, I would be counseling, my friends in the Ministry of External Affairs and elsewhere, that that's the one world you shouldn't take too seriously and you shouldn't get worked up about. What you need to do is do your best to rebuild the partnership with the U.S. and let the U.S. partnership with China take its own course. As long as we have a robust relationship with India, it doesn't really matter what our relationship with China is.
And maybe there's a other step, Ashley, which you didn't mention, which is do the best we can to make our own economy more resilient in order to help us deal with this or any other future shock.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a precondition. That's a precondition irrespective of the kind of world we face, right? We have an obligation to our own people. The United States is, whether we like it or not, a hegemonic power. It is in our interest to preserve that hegemony. And we can't quite do that unless we keep the sinews of our material capabilities in good shape. And so, yes, absolutely, we have to do that first and foremost.
My guest on the show this week is Ashley J. Tellis. He's the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment. Ashley, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.